Alright, so we're moving along to do an analysis on 1999's The Matrix, directed by the Wachowskis, and I want to give quite a few remarks before we get ahead with the analysis, so I'll just leave a timestamp in the description if you want to skip the introduction. I think The Matrix is in many ways very interesting to look at, as it introduces a lot of philosophical themes, and in quite a deep way. It reminds me in many ways of 2001's Space Odyssey in that sense, and that philosophy really gets a full treatment, which you might not notice at first because there's these very intrusive, incredibly directed, visually rich scenes where, deep contemplation about philosophy is not exactly at the forefront of your mind while watching these scenes, but there is really a lot to uncover in terms of the film. In addition, there's a lot of religious themes throughout, so we'll also have to look at that. But mostly we'll look at the philosophy. And we can really draw some sort of equivalence to perhaps an introductory philosophy class where we're going to be looking at some common themes within. Also, if we discuss the context of really the late 90s, it was really quite a big success, and it sort of bolstered a lot of these copy films later on, such as The Cell, starring Jennifer Lopez, as I remember. As well as there's a film, The 13th Floor, which was released the same year, which really is very, very identical to that of The Matrix. But The Matrix is, in my opinion, a much better film, though. But it's still worthwhile to checking out The 13th Floor if you haven't watched it already. Still widely underappreciated, but it is the lesser film, so we're going to stick with The Matrix. I would claim also that the Matrix is rich enough in terms of philosophy that we can look at really a lot of the major themes that one would tackle in some sort of introductory class, either in high school or college, in terms of philosophy. And especially at the forefront would be the problem of skepticism, the problem of trusting our sense perceptions, and this is going to relate some really famous examples throughout philosophy, such as Plato's cave analogy, where we're tackling the problem of illusion, as well as looking at Descartes later on in his Meditations, which is really a stellar book to start off with in terms of philosophy. It's not too long either, so I would recommend reading it. In addition, there's a lot of epistemological themes contained within the film. We might ask question, what does it mean to have knowledge, and what's the role of perception within knowledge, and how much can we question our perceptions, how reliable are they, and can we really find some sort of justifications for our knowledge? Is it possible to define truth? We might ask, what is truth even to begin with? And can we make progress within philosophy, which was a really important problem, I think, for a lot of philosophers, such as perhaps Bertrand Russell, for example. He was really interested in philosophy being able to make progress within its praxis. But this was later questioned, for example, by the postmodernists, which prop up into the film as well, where we have Baudrillard's most famous book being a prop in the movie, which we will get into. We'll tackle the themes from postmodernism as well, or at least a small subsection relating to that of Baudrillard. There's also discussions about technology to be had and artificial intelligence, what the interaction between technology and man is, how does this really shape our societal structure to begin with, and how do we interact with that of technology. And these are questions really the Wachowski discussed themselves, as we know that for a fact, since they gave one of the recommended readings for the actors, which was one book discussing this very theme. They actually recommended 3 books, and I'll list all of them in the description. I'd also recommend, if you want to start to get into more philosophy, that I might discuss very briefly here how to approach a text, or one recommended way at least of approaching a text within philosophy. You might start off with the first component being some sort of exegesis of the text, where this just means a sort of critical examination and interpretation of the text, and making a reflection. And it's important to note, if you understand the arguments given within the text and understand what you're reading, of that of course comes first. And the second component is really reflecting upon your initial reflection. Did you change your mind when reading the text? What did you learn specifically that you didn't know from beforehand? And has this widened your horizons in any way? Has this shifted your position in any way, you might ask? And thirdly, which is not so much asked, but I think is really important, especially if you look at older philosophies, to try to relate the arguments in their own time from a historical perspective. Such as, we might give the example of Plato, for instance, who, since Socrates didn't write anything down, what we have passed on from Socrates is really the writings of Plato himself. So you might ask how accurate of a representation Plato gives of Socrates. This is sort of known as the Socratic problem in many ways in philosophy. In addition, we might ask how much of Plato's thoughts are really positions that he took personally, and how much of his opinions were really more of an idealization of what he meant was important for the philosopher to engage in. That is, we might ask how much of a capital P Platonist Plato really was. So these really more of historical approaches and historical understandings are really important as well in the text, because you have to understand not just the arguments from your own timeline, but try to address how congruent they are with the perceptions and ideas of the philosophers themselves writing in their own time frame. Moving on to religion, I mean, there's a lot of, I would say, Christianity and Buddhism themes layered in throughout. More of a sort of syncretic mess in many ways, where you have overlapping religious stories and themes propping into the movie. I'd also like to touch upon a little bit of Taoism, I guess, since I read some of the text there. Hinduism I'm not so familiar with, but there might be some worthwhile themes that I'll explore there as well. If you want to follow the videos in even greater detail, as I mentioned, I'll leave references so you can follow along, and you can make some recommendations as well if there's a certain theme you want to be addressed which hasn't been addressed. But let's start diving into the opening scenes for an analysis, and I hope you are as excited as me to dig a little bit further beneath the surface and start really engaging with the film and looking at really many themes that have been put into the film, which is a really remarkable achievement in many ways, and it certainly serves as a sci-fi classic film in my opinion, and there are many intellectually interesting ideas that are presented, I think. We are in the initial opening scenes treated to a search or trace of what will be revealed to be the main protagonist in the film, namely that of Neo. Neo, or to use his bland birth white name of Thomas Anderson, is a person who has been wandering the earth and leading, as Agent Smith comments upon later in the film, two lives, one as that of a daytime computer programmer for a large impersonal corporate structure named the Metacortex Software Company, and the other as that of a nocturnal hacker who supplies illicit illegal software for a price. We may here ask the question at this point as to what is to be taken as the significance of this trace in the opening scenes. Two attractive responses immediately come to mind for me here, one being in terms of making a comment upon the ever-increasing expansion of surveillance upon entry into the new century, as we remember here that the Matrix was released in the year of 1999. Therefore, this trend of the multiplication of both surveillance systems as well as a corresponding loss of personal privacy has been due to the rapid advancements in technology, which in turn means that the domains of digital communication, data collection, as well as surveillance technology have been massively expanded as time has progressed. This might come across as an almost bland point to make in terms of our reality nowadays, but we should not forget that we need not progress too far back in time in order to find wildly nonchalant opinions regarding this trend. Take for instance the 1980s, which saw the release of Alan Moore's graphic novel V for Vendetta, which takes place in a dystopian post-apocalyptical future of the United Kingdom, where a theocratic neo-fascistic party named Norsefire has seized control. The future in this scenario is in fact set to the year of 1997, where, following in the lines of government officials and other party sympathizers wishing to exert greater social control, the future is enveloped in ever greater means of surveillance, including but not limited to the mounting of surveillance cameras on all corners, flooding the city streets of London. The interesting fact to note here is the reception the work got upon its initial release, where relating the fact of the depicted mass surveillance in terms of mounted surveillance cameras, the public obviously felt that this was indeed a depiction of a dystopic nightmare scenario, where notions of extended personal liberties were severely threatened. In other words, a true nightmare for many. Fast forward to 1997, and even more in our own timeline, a plethora of surveillance cameras enacting its gazing eyes to track society have indeed become the norm, with little to no resistance from the public, as we have become habituated to ever-increasing technological gadgetry expansions, as surveillance cameras have become ubiquitous in our society. This is very much at play in the Matrix as well, where we witness the associated level of both an extremely interventionist authority as well as an enormous capacity for intelligence gathering capabilities, personified here by Agent Smith, who serves as, among others, as a representation figure for dominant intelligence agencies. Perhaps they are even serving the role as that of a precursor of sorts for the global surveillance disclosures pertaining to the NSA as revealed by Edward Snowden in 2013. Making a last comment upon V for Vendetta, it also turns out that Moore may have assumed too much in terms of the invocation of an apocalyptic event in order to legitimize the rise of neo-fascism along with theocratic homophobic currents, following increasing levels of paranoia seen in society, which in turn is connected with escalating measures of surveillance. This is a fact touched upon in the introduction to V for Vendetta. It's 1988 now. Margaret Thatcher is entering her third term of office and talking confidently of an unbroken conservative leadership well into the next century. My youngest daughter is 7, and the tabloid press are circulating the idea of concentration camps for persons with AIDS. The new riot police wear black visors, as do their horses, and their vans have rotating video cameras mounted on top. The government has expressed a desire to eradicate homosexuality, even as an abstract concept, and one can only speculate as to which minority will be the next legislated against. Moving closer to our own present time frame, we may relate the themes of surveillance to the rise of the complexity of language models following the release of ChatGPT in 2022. ChatGPT and related models are obviously a major topic in regards to themes just as, for instance, mass data collection, where personal information is shared on a regular basis, job insecurity as employment positions, even those requiring higher degrees of education, have the potential for becoming automated, or the leveraging and exploitation of these technologies in order to commit identity theft. However, what has been less discussed in my opinion is the greater facilitation of social control, which advanced language models have the potentiality to enact. We may relate here the social credit system as seen in China under the development of the government of the People's Republic of China from 2014 as an example, where one can easily see the potentiality of using language models such as ChatGPT in order to both collect and share data in relation to getting increased levels of social control into the lives of ordinary citizens. This will in turn also further add to the establishment of a record system which lets businesses, individuals, and government institutions be tracked and evaluated according to criterions as to what the government of the People's Republic of China deemed to be relevant in terms of trustworthiness. But let us leave the topic of surveillance, which we will further touch upon in upcoming scenes, for a more philosophical interpretation, and move on to the second response to the initial opening scenes, which can be seen as a more direct interpretation, namely the religious connotation, which is invoked in searching for what Morpheus believes to be the chosen selected, or as he likes to put it, the one. This certainly bears resemblance to that of themes stemming from the Abrahamic traditions of the Bible, where we may relate the narration of Saul on its way to Damascus to persecute the Christians as an example, where Saul, also known as Paul the Apostle, who initially serves the role as that of a zealous Pharisee, has a religious intervention where upon inspection, following a bright light shining from heaven, Jesus is revealed to be delivering a message of transformation. Saul here continues to undergo a transformative change and eventually takes on the guise as that of an instrument for the deliverance of the message of Christ. In similar fashion, we find the Old Testament, the story of Abraham's handmaiden Hagar, described as an Egyptian slave woman in the book of Genesis. As Abraham and his wife Sarai are of advanced age and yet without a child, Hagar is delivered to Abraham in order to impregnate the woman. However, tensions arise between Sarai and Hagar after Hagar becomes pregnant, which results in the fleeing to the desert of the latter, where she subsequently encounters an angelic presence in the form of an angel. The angel here subsequently delivers a transformative message of the conception of her child, who it is said should be named Ishmael, and of who will give rise to a great flock of people. Thus, in this biblical narration, we again see a message of transformation being delivered, as well as Hagar herself serving as an enactment of God's plan, at what progresses leads to the descendants of Abraham, who themselves have a role to partake in various biblical themes that unfold according to the Bible. We also mention here that the conception of Ishmael is central to another Abrahamic religion, namely that of Islam, where Ishmael serves as the ancestor for a flock of Arab peoples, thus fermenting its significance to the religion. Returning to the film, the heavenly powers of God making a revelatory entrance into the lives of chosen individuals, which in turn report voices being spoken, or perhaps a great spiritual vision being brought to them, have been replaced by the digital medium of the computer, with its fidelity for the transmission of bytes of information through a combination of hardware and software protocols, playing into the characteristic decentralized nature of the Internet, which enables seamless communication between computers across the globe. The computer thus serves as for now as a lifeless silicon entity, which makes possible the potentiality of being at all places at once, where instead of angelic presences which descend down to the realm of the earth and to deliver a message of transformation, the computer is here instead being used as a vessel by Morpheus in order to deliver his first messages, meant to spark curiosity and a yearning for more than what is on display, for that of its citizens who have been transfixed in a state of hypermodernity, where in fact the underlying ontology will reveal itself to be nothing more than that of a simulation. Neo, like Paul, therefore can be seen to undergo a transformative change as the movie progresses, where Morpheus serves as a catalyst, much like Jesus in the story of Saul, where an underlying theme in both cases reflect the profound change which can occur in a person's life under the guidance of a sage. We witness several police officers attempting to bring into custody the figure of Trinity, who is seen behind the vintage hotel door numbered 303 in the film. The numbering of 303 can be seen as a direct allusion to the character of Trinity, whose name symbolizes that of the Christian Trinity, namely the Christian triadic composite of the Christian God as the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Is then not Trinity in many ways the facilitator of moving from the realm of the constructed simulated reality to the transcendence of this realm? A transcendence which for Neo will mean, as we witness in the end of the film, a resurrection where Neo positions himself as the previously prophesied by Morpheus as the One. Additional meanings relating to 303 may be seen in relation to the Roland TB-303 synthesizer used heavily in electronic soundtracks, which also feature in the film, or more interestingly relating to the status code of HTTP 303, also known as See Other, which is an HTTP response code notifying that a specific requested resource can be found at another location. In other words, this serves as a way to redirect web applications, much like potential blue pill targets are redirected into the realm of the red pill, or as Morpheus refers to it, the real world. Lastly, the numbering of 303 can obviously be seen in contrast to the numbering of Neo's apartment door, as that of 101, which obviously relates the character of Thomas Anderson, as that of the Chosen One. In fact, to break down both the birth name as well, Anderson in Thomas Anderson means Son of Man, which is a direct phrase used to describe Christ, while Thomas may be directly tied with the disciple of Thomas, who like Neo is full of doubt, upon initial inspection. For the case of Neo, he doubts his initial abilities, while Thomas in the Bible is doubtful of the resurrection of Christ, following the resurrected encounter Jesus has had with the other disciples without his presence. However, following Jesus' other resurrected encounter when he is present, he transcends his feelings of doubt, exclaiming, "My Lord and my God." Likewise, we will witness Neo overcoming his own sense of doubt as the movie progresses and he is faced with an increasing amount of hurdles along the way. Moving on from Thomas Anderson, the normal name for the guy with a social security number, to his use of the pseudonym of Neo, which is of course a simple anagram spelling one, in reference to him being the chosen one in the film. In addition, Neo comes from the Greek prefix, word meaning new, which in the movie might reference a new coming of age with the story arc involving Neo. In general, the choice of opening for the film as that of shaking its audiences, so to speak, with a daring, gravity-bending action sequence, which can be seen, if anything, as making heavy references to that of the world of anime films. This is no concealed fact from the vantage point of the directors, Lana and Lily Wachowski, previously the Wachowski brothers, who openly admit to drawing a large portion of inspiration from that of animes. The anime Ghost in the Shell and Ninja Scroll are named in particular by the directors as heavy inspirations. One may in addition see the characteristic signature technique of bullet time from the film as something which contorts our everyday perception of bullets, and in extension the laws of physics, which has, as I would argue, an even greater home in that of animation. The justification for this is that animation is always working on an additional level of abstraction, in which both violence as well as the suspension of physics appear less discernible as one becomes habituated to the abstracted realm of animation, which is always presented in terms of its medium as being a certain distance removed from that of real-to-real life. For more comments on the difficulty in comic adaptations, I recommend watching a previous video I did on the topic called How Marvel Fails, Comic Adaptations and Challenges, which I will link. If we explore the opening scenes from a film theory perspective, then the choice of delivering an action sequence early on in the film in order to follow up the film with some rather large portions of a heavy use of speech later on is a very well-established technique within movie making. In fact, this is so common that it can be explicitly referenced within film theory as the term front-loading action, which aims at strategically placing action scenes early on in the film in order to both create excitement as well as in some sense legitimizing longer sequences of non-action later on in the film. From personal experience, a great example of this technique, which was also how I became aware of the technique, was from 1993's Carlito's Way, starring Al Pacino and Sean Penn, which exhibits an early, very memorable action sequence involving a pool table and guns blazing. Highly recommended and also characteristic in terms of its use of front-loading action, if you have not already seen it. The opening shots of Neo that we witness are memorable as it comes from us from the perspective of his computer, which, like in real life, is always operating at a faster pace in terms of its potentiality for new generation of information, which is always ahead of what we can feasibly process. In addition, there is a pertinent point to make in terms of the Matrix operating as that of a constructed simulation of our world, where we are in turn idly operating under an assumed assumption of reality, much like we see Neo in a state of deep sleep, willfully accepting the dream world, as we all do without hesitation. Sleep, then, may be directly tied with that of the problem of skepticism in philosophy, which again challenges us in ultimately justifying knowledge claims where skepticism raises doubts about the reliability of our beliefs and methods of justification. Here, much like Neo, deep in his dream state, we may likewise ask if we truly may know anything with clear certainty. After all, could we not ourselves be falsely perceiving the external world around us, which presents itself then nothing more than that of a dream world, which negates our access to actual reality? This is a problem which has long troubled philosophers,
and is aptly named the dream argument, which relates the fact that since the act of dreaming provides evidence in favor of our very senses we use to distinguish reality from that of illusion, should it not follow then that our senses cannot fully be trusted, and a natural conclusion of this would be that any state which is dependent upon our senses should be very closely examined for its truth correspondence to reality. If our senses cannot fully be trusted a priori, we could then ask if we have any reason to believe that our perception of reality itself is reliable. This argument, at the very least, even if we do not accept it without question, should motivate us to give a proper account for our sense of trust in our senses, as well as taking the problem of how it is we know that we claim to know seriously. It's also one of those problems in philosophy, which has a rich history with the earliest formalized account in the Western tradition stemming from that of Plato and his dialogue Theaetetus, where he presents the illusion argument through the famed philosopher of Socrates. Socrates here questions whether our perceptions in waking life are any more reliable than what they present themselves as in dreams. This then again opens up the floodgates, as it were, to the external world being illusory, where the very status of the real world is in question. We will also witness Socrates making his way into the film in an upcoming scene in which Neo visits the oracle, who has inscribed a plaque in her kitchen containing the same words which was found in the Pronaos, translated as the forecourt of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. It's no coincidence then that the film is packed to the rim with philosophical ideas and concepts, many of which I hope to explore through our series Investigation into the Film. An iteration of the dream argument has also been relayed by Eastern sources in China through an ancient text from the late Warring States period known as the Shuangzi, which gives various stories as well as anecdotes pertaining to the themes of Taoist wisdom. The text remains a classic or must-read within Taoism, along with the more famous Tao Te Ching, which is credited to the most likely composite figure of Lao Tzu, where the Shangxi is credited to the Chinese philosopher of Shuangxi or Shuangshu. At the end of the second chapter, on the equality of things of the Shuangxi, we are treated to the dream argument in the form of a story known as Dreams of Being a Butterfly. Here, the story seeks to undermine the at the surface level assumed position that the external reality is naively true. In opposition, Shuangxi seems to point his finger in the opposite direction by claiming that the distinction between waking and dreaming life is in essence another false dichotomy. For clarity here, we here give one translation from a portion of the text. Suddenly he woke up, and there he was, solid and unmistakable Shuangsu. But he didn't know if he was Shuangsu who had dreamt he was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that he was Shuangsu. Between Zhuangzi and the butterfly there must be some distinction. This is called the transformation of things. This will not be the first time we touch upon the dream argument, or for that matter the problems to be addressed within skepticism, where we will touch upon other contributions in other videos, such as Plato's famous cave allegory, which certainly deserves mentioning, as well as exploring Descartes' contemplations on the topic, which are to be found in his Meditations, which, if you are interested in philosophy, would make for one of the very first books I would recommend as reading, along with Bertrand Russell's The Problems of Philosophy. Getting back to the film, after Neo is seen questioning his waking state, much like Shuangzi in the butterfly story, his computer oddly corresponds with him, asking him to cryptically follow the white rabbit, which we will shortly understand that this relates directly to a female tattoo and the locality of a questionable late 90s nightclub scene. We see Neo preparing a disk of some illicit software taken from a book, which turns out to be none other than Baudrillard's Simulations and Simulacrum, which immediately warrants some discussions into the ideas concerning Baudrillard, along with some reflections on postmodern philosophy. To start off, it should be noted that Baudrillard's own reception to the movie was negative in a one-sided fashion upon its initial release, but as we will see shortly, Baudrillard can at the same time be seen to be contradicting himself in the sense that he rejected any kind of conceptual analysis, or perhaps a better term here to be used would be taxonomy, of cinema, such as that undertaken by Deleuze, for instance, another postmodernist in his Cinema series of books. Thus, in Baudrillard's critique of the Matrix, he commits to conceptual analysis himself of trying to definitively interpret both the true meaning and content of the film in question. For instance, by referencing the Matrix as completely failing to grasp his philosophy by failing to distinguish between the Platonic idea of the illusion of reality and Baudrillard's own take on simulation, which in turn sees representation and reality imploding on each other to the point where one can no longer meaningfully distinguish between the terms, where Baudrillard further concludes that to quote, "the real is no longer possible," he is himself directly engaging with the idea that the film has a definite meaning as well as content. However, for the sake of argument, let's put this criticism behind us, having brought it up already once, and explore some of his ideas further, where we begin by introducing the philosophy known as postmodernism. Postmodernism can be difficult in many ways to define, as it remains incredibly multifaceted, where among others, it rejects notions such as grand narratives and attempts to pin down totality definitions regarding domains such as truth, history, and progress, while at the same time challenging fixed meanings definitions, such that the very notion of providing a definitive definition seems at surface level to go against much of the spirit within postmodernism. However, that does not stop us from addressing some of the main concerns regarding postmodernism, which made its introduction in the 20th century and which is very much associated with a line of male French philosophers. Postmodernism sought among others to critique modernity along the lines of its ideas concerning a clear-cut progression, rationality, as well as aiming to give a definite meaning of truth. Postmodernists therefore sought to localize such notions as truth, progress, and rationality, which they argued in terms of language that it may contain inherent inadequacies in conveying such absolute notions, as well as emphasizing the subjectivity of opinions, which may differ widely according to specific social contexts as well as culture. Other relevant themes involve the analysis of power, which was very much undertaken by the French philosopher Foucault, who analyzed the relationship between power and knowledge, among others, and themes of desire, which was touched upon by Deleuze, another French philosopher. Baudrillard, which we will for the most part concern ourselves with here, is most famous for giving a critique of our social age and for studying the interactions between symbols, representations, as well as critically examining the nature of reality. We end this section on an introduction to postmodernism by looking at a definition as given by the Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if at nothing else gives some insights into the concept and themes of postmodernist thought. To quote, "That postmodernism is indefinable is a truism. However, it can be described as a set of critical, strategic, and rhetorical practices employing concepts such as difference, repetition, the trace, the simulacrum, and hyperreality to destabilize other concepts such as presence, identity, historical progress, epistemic certainty, and the univocity of meaning." Getting back to Baudrillard, any form of conceptual analysis for him falls short in trying to capture the true nature of the landscape of contemporary media culture, which can be linked to an age of hypermodernity. Hypermodernity here again gives an account for our present age, which is linked with both that of an intensification as well as acceleration of features associated with modernity, which involve features such as the acceleration of modern technology, media, advertising, as well as consumer culture, where we have reached a point of oversaturation in many ways, according to Baudrillard, where reality and representation have become indistinguishable, and where the very symbols and simulations that inhabit our world have gained more significance than the real world that they once referenced to. This concept, which he refers to as an implosion, is directly referenced in Simulations and Simulacrum, which we witness in the form of a prop in the film, where in the context of the philosophical analysis Baudrillard wishes to embark upon, the very boundaries between the real and the virtual which implode on top of one another. In opposition to then the problem of illusion, which we will tackle in a later video, relating Plato's cave allegory, which cites the inherent difficulty in distinguishing between the real and the illusory, following in the lines of the concept of implosion, the very boundaries between illusion and the real are themselves dissolved, which in turn nullifies this strong dual opposition. We might further relate just how controversial this notion is by stating that the very simulation of images, representations, as well as our cultural fantasies, inherit the same sense of significance as well as the face value of reality as what they are meant to represent. To introduce some new lingo, we may state the simulations, which we referenced, are tied to what we will introduce as the term simulacrum, which may be taken to mean a representation or a copy of something. In reference to Baudrillard's philosophy, there exists an interconnectedness between the terms simulation and simulacrum, as both terms help to blur the lines between reality and representations, where in left-to-right fashion, starting with simulations, as these simulations expand into our consciousness of reality, becoming more prevalent as well as the same time detaching themselves from their original domain of reference, which directly leads to the right implication arrow, as it were, to the notion of simulacrums, which seek to replace the representation with that of the real, where the overall outcome is one of loss of reference to the underlying reality, as well as opening the curtains of a hyperreal environment. To quote, "The impossibility of rediscovering an absolute level of the real is of the same order as the impossibility of staging an illusion. Illusion is no longer possible because the real is no longer possible." For clarity, I will here reproduce an example, which is a variant of an example I have previously heard, which ties in nicely into the notions of a simulacrum from Baudrillard's philosophy. That is, we may imagine here a young couple on holiday together in Rome, wishing to go on a date in the hopes of perhaps sparking up a further romance together. Since they are both in agreeance that indeed Italian cuisine is a very tasty choice, and what better way of experiencing the authenticity of the cuisine style than going out to the streets of Rome in search of a charming restaurant, where perhaps they hope to get a taste of the very underrated as well as tasty Roman pasta dish of pasta alla griscia. The couple quickly finds a restaurant which they hope is good, despite the fact that it also happens to be located at a very touristy spot in Rome. While waiting to order, the couple takes in the surroundings of the restaurant, which feature among others the characteristic photo of Marlon Brando from The Godfather, seen here wearing a black suit with a red rose on prominent display, located from his perspective in his left upper pocket of the suit jacket. While the female member of this couple rolls her eyes of this particular touristy addition to the restaurant, the male counterpart remarks with great affection in how Marlon Brando can really be seen as an authentic iconotype of the typified representation of the Italian mafioso gangster, as iterated through an Italian-American locality situated in the post-World War period of the 20th century. In fact, he goes further than this and claims that Marlon Brando is in many ways, through his portrayal of the figure, what we immediately associate with that of Italian-American culture, although it be it from a rather stereotypified vantage point. The problem from the above example should be obvious from our now ongoing discussion into the philosophy of Jean Baudrillard, where the male part of the couple has, in his attempt to give a proper account of Marlon Brando, completely imploded notions of reality with that of representation. This is again because the underlying reality is that Marlon Brando is of no Italian or Italian-American origin, such that the presentation of Vito Corleone in the Godfather film has taken on the role as that of a cultural simulacrum, where the actor performance of Marlon Brando in the film has taken on a representation of its own, whereby the underlying person of Marlon Brando as a reality in terms of a public figure, has lost his reference to the original reality of which he is a member. Lastly, in reference to Baudrillard's philosophy in this video, we will explore some notions from the last chapter of Simulations and Simulacrum, titled On Nihilism. For the observant viewer, he or she will notice that this is the chapter which is directly shown in the video, as Neo is seen rummaging through the book in order to find his illegal software. On Nihilism relates nihilism, which is perhaps most closely associated with that of the German philosopher of Nietzsche, who against common misconceptions was not himself a nihilist, believing it to be bad for humanity, where Baudrillard in this chapter wants to relate nihilist philosophy with contemporary life or from his view into the hyperreal. Baudrillard here argues that nihilism has a central place in our society, since according to him, our world around us has been subjugated through the process of simulation and simulacrum, which again leads to the dissolution of the construction of meaning, where the whole philosophical conceptual idea of an authentic experience comes into question for its inhabitants. Reality loses its grounding, as it were, where the surrounding atmosphere of our congenial existence is instead relayed in terms of everything becoming a simulation, where demarcated distinctions between truth, fiction, simulation, representation, and reality become irrelevant, where we are therefore, according to the nihilist tradition, left without meaning. Relating the transparent nature of nihilism in our contemporary society, Baudrillard thus states that today's nihilism is one of transparency, and it is in some sense more radical, more crucial than in its prior and historical forms, because this transparency, this irresolution, is indissolubly that of the system, and that of all the theory that still pretends to analyze it. When God died, there was still Nietzsche to say so, the great nihilist before the eternal and the cadaver of the eternal. But before the simulated transparency of all things, before the simulacrum of the materialist or idealist realization of the world in hyperreality, God is not dead, he has become hyper-real. There is no longer a theoretical or critical God to recognize his own. Likewise for Neo in the film, he tries to discern meaning of his constructed world around him, where he comes into learning that the world he has inhabited is nothing but a simulation itself. He is thus torn between the assessment of his past experiences, which have for nearly his entire existence taken place within a constructed reality in which he must find a way to reconcile meaning with that of an underlying false ontology, which has until now preoccupied him. Returning to the film, where we witness Neo exchanging his illicit software with a questionable underground character named Choi, knocking at his door while complaining about being unsure, as if he is awake or dreaming, which directly references the dream argument discussed earlier. Choi directly references mescaline, a psychedelic drug. Psychedelic drugs in general are again something which are referenced in terms of skepticism in philosophy, as the altered state of consciousness from the drugs induces very often a behavior of questioning the reliableness of everyday perceptions. In fact, a common reported experience relating the effects of psychedelics, or in drug lingo an acid trip, is that it not just seems as real as the real world, but rather even more real in terms of experience. Obviously, having an experience which itself seems real, but can be justifiably explained in terms of the effects of molecules in our brains, such as induced hallucinations by drugs, will not justify, according to many philosophers, that these experiences are themselves real or unmasking more of what is real in our own ontology. This is a very common argument which will be brought forth by proponents of the philosophical view of naive realism, for instance, a position which posits that our perceptions accurately represent the physical properties along with objects of the external world. Moving on, we witness the very chicly dressed female named Dujour, who serves as the girlfriend of the underground character of Choi, displaying her tattoo briefly, which takes the form of a white rabbit, which was earlier referenced by Neo's computer monitor. The white rabbit may here be further referenced in terms of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland from 1865, which tells the story of a young girl named Alice who finds herself falling through a rabbit hole, in which she enters another realm, so to speak, much like the realm of the red pill seen in the Matrix. But for Alice, it is this new realm which is the fantasy, while for the Matrix, the red pill realm serves, at least upon initial inspection, as the real world according to Morpheus. The fact that one may relate the problem of skepticism to whichever world one inhabits, including the one seen here to hide behind the simulation of the Matrix, is a theme I wish was explored more in the first film of the trilogy. Although I will revisit this criticism in the upcoming scene, in which Morpheus gives Neo the choice between two pills, where the former directly addresses the red pill world as that of the fantasy, making a reference to Alice in Wonderland. Furthermore, like Neo is the chosen one in the film, Alice is the chosen one in the children's book, where both engage on a journey which, for all intents and purposes, is grander than themselves, and which will require sacrifices along the way. There is also the problem of free will, which can be referenced in both scenarios, where seemingly for both characters, they make their own deliberation in terms of choices and may both be characterized as free-spirited. We will look at the problem of free will later on in the series, as well when we address the scene in which Neo meets the Oracle in the film, which is again a nice entry point into the philosophical problem. A last remark we will make here in the buyer scene of the hacker services of Neo, along with the following nightclub scene, is in relation to the wardrobe style of the opposing characters. There is, I claim here, a very much a clear message of transgression, fetishism, as well as individuality, which can all be related to sexual liberation, as well as an opposition to the conformity through its means of self-expression and rebellion. Considering the fact that both the Wachowski brothers have since the release swapped their genders and identity and now identify as trans women, there may very well be a latent significance in many ways in terms of the direction of the wardrobe design in the film. I also recently did a video on anarchism, where we may here relate the freedom of choice to wear what one wishes along the lines of anarchist philosophy, in terms of both individual autonomy as well as a celebration of nonconformity and diversity. The greatest significance in terms of the upcoming scenes in which Trinity engages with Neo for the first time in the nightclub, which we witness, may be seen in relation to Trinity getting a first glimpse of the figure she has been told that she will ultimately fall in love with from the Oracle. This does not mean, however, that she immediately gives into this urge, but rather that she is weighing the importance of the encounter, both in terms of the potentiality of Morpheus being correct in his assertions to Neo being the one, as well as assessing her own feelings. In addition, the scene functions to further establish both the competence as well as notoriety, as it is revealed that she was the one hacking away at Neo's computer, along with another infamous hacker feat. There is also the upcoming action scene in which Morpheus guides Neo through the office building, which relates to the fact that while Neo assesses the gravity of the situation, he is not yet committed to give up his own fears along with the necessary sacrifices in order to reach the necessary transformation of him, which we will see him embarking upon throughout the duration of the film, which also establishes his character arc development. We'll leave off this first part of the analysis here, where we will immediately see the introduction of Agent Smith in the next segment, which should be interesting, along with more explorations into both philosophy, as well as touching upon different religions. Please leave a like, subscribe, and comment if you find these videos interesting, and I hope you will gather some appreciation for the film, even if you, like me, have watched it countless times before. So yeah, until next time.